In the first part of our story about the confrontation between the Irish and the English, we touched on the medieval uprising, the mass famine, British suppression tactics, and made it to the 20th century, where we covered the Easter Rising. But now it's time to talk about perhaps the most striking episodes in the struggle for Ireland's independence. Ahead, you will hear stories about the Civil War, the Irish Republican Army, the religious clash in which the Vatican intervened, and the influence of the United States. Let's go. The War of Independence. After the suppression of the Easter Rising, public opinion became sharply radicalized. The public executions of the uprising's leaders, arrests, and repression led to increased support for the national movement. In January of 1919, the parliamentary faction of Sinn Féin proclaimed the Irish Republic and began armed struggle. The main armed force became the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, which by 1920 had an official strength of about 100,000 people, of whom around 15,000 were active participants, and about 3,000 fighters were constantly under arms. They killed police officers and their informants, kidnapped and killed British officials, destroyed administrative buildings, obstructed tax collection, and carried out sabotage against British troops. The Irish Republican Army did not operate as a conventional army. Thanks to the genuine support of the population, the fighters could easily blend in among civilians. This tactic caused even more anger in London. In 18 months of conflict, English security forces carried out about 40,000 raids, arrested nearly 5,000 suspects, organized 1,604 armed attacks on gatherings of Irish Republican Army fighters, and killed 77 civilians, including women and children. One of the largest episodes of the confrontation was the arson of the Ministry of Local Government building in Dublin. The Irish Republican Army seized the building, destroyed documents, and symbolically attacked the British administrative system. As a result, 5 volunteers were killed, and about 80 were taken prisoner. Seeing that the usual methods could not defeat the guerrillas, the British created their own paramilitary units, the Black and Tans. These units carried out acts of intimidation and terror against both open and covert supporters of independence. Moreover, only hardened veterans of the First World War with high morale and training were accepted into their ranks. In addition, they sincerely hated the Irish, whom they called rebels and draft dodgers, because the Irish were in no hurry to fight for the ambitions of the British crown. The burning of Balbriggan is one of the most notorious attacks by British Black and Tans units on civilians. On September 20th, 1920, after 2 policemen were killed by Irish Republican Army fighters, a unit of about 100 men stormed into the town of Balbriggan, smashed dozens of houses, set a factory on fire, and killed at least 2 civilians. The victims were ordinary residents, not connected to the militants. Delving into the history of the conflict, researchers point to correspondence between colonial office officers, where the term moral exhaustion policy is used in reference to the Black and Tans. In the Irish archives in Dublin, letters from local commanders of the Irish Republican Army have been preserved, stating that the Black and Tans acted not as police, but as an instrument of terror aimed at making the people themselves turn away from the uprising. The partisans were greatly aided by the fact that their units were semi-autonomous, lacking the rigid vertical chain of command found in conventional armies. Even after achieving local successes, it was simply impossible for the English to completely suppress the entire movement. The Irish created a situation in which England was essentially at war with the entire country, and there seemed to be no end in sight to this war. The digital concentration camp hadn't been invented yet, and the English had no chance of completely suppressing the rebels. However, the Irish Republican Army had its own plans. They wanted to take advantage of the situation and push London toward a favorable deal. By 1921, such an agreement had taken shape. The leaders of the Irish nationalists and the British government signed the Anglo-Irish Treaty, under which most of Ireland became a dominion within the British Commonwealth, following the example of Canada and Australia. Under the treaty, Ireland received broad autonomy, but not full independence. Northern Ireland, where a significant Anglo-Scottish Protestant population lived, remained under English control. But even such a seemingly successful treaty for the Irish still had a flaw. It caused a split among the Republicans, some of whom wanted to continue the struggle until full independence. There is a fairly popular version that the British government had planned the partition of the island in advance as a strategy of control. Documents from that time indicate discussions about the 6 counties in the north and the creation of Northern Ireland as a permanent foothold loyal to London. A civil war broke out in the newly formed Ireland. During the street fighting, many heroes of the War for Independence were killed, including the first Prime Minister and head of the Irish Republican Army, Michael Collins. Officially, Collins died in an ambush on August 22, 1922, but the facts indicate that he was eliminated by British agents. The site of the ambush in Beal na Blath was under surveillance by former British intelligence officers. The official investigation was conducted hastily and did not include a ballistic examination. During such an examination, it is possible to determine with centimeter accuracy from which position the shots were fired and from what weapon, and many other details that often change the course of the investigation. The very fact that there was no ballistic examination already says something. Documents preserved in British archives indicate Collins remains a potential factor of instability. As is often the case, people like Michael Collins were inconvenient for everyone. His death suited both sides, the British and the moderate wing of the Irish, who wanted to stop the radicals. Researcher Christopher Andrew, the official historian of British intelligence MI5, noted that in 1921, an agent with the codename Informant 37 was in direct contact with Michael Collins's closest associates. It was precisely because of the large number of British agents that some Irish Republican Army operations failed literally within hours of starting. In London, as always, there were cunning politicians who wanted the treaty supporters to win and supplied the pro-treaty forces with weapons. There are even two radically opposing films. For moderate views, there's the 1996 film Michael Collins, starring Liam Neeson. The events are presented from a moderately nationalist point of view. The British are shown as enemies, but not as demons, and Collins is portrayed as a tragic figure forced to choose between war and peace. This is the perspective of moderate Republicans, those who believed that independence could be achieved step by step, not through total war. The second film is The Wind That Shakes the Barley, from 2006. This film is a grim, emotional, and highly ideological version of the same events, but seen through the eyes of ordinary Irish people. The plot follows two brothers who fight against the British and then end up on opposite sides of the barricades in the Irish Civil War. A state within a state. After the signing of the treaty and a brief civil war, the Irish Republican Army split into many factions. Each of them declared itself the real Irish Republican Army, but, after a few years, most of them returned under a common flag. From the 1920s to the 1940s, the relationship between the Irish Republican Army and the government of independent Ireland went from mutual respect to hostility. The new cabinet was made up of former revolutionaries, but now they had to think about the state, not about guerrilla warfare. The Irish Republican Army, on the other hand, demanded a complete break with Britain and the unification of the island. When the organization's leadership tried to use contacts with Nazi Germany during World War II, it became a reason for repression by both London and Dublin. The Irish authorities, although maintaining neutrality, acted together with the British, arresting commanders, eliminating underground weapons caches, and carrying out secret executions. As a result, the Irish Republican Army went deep underground, but it could not disappear completely. It took root in society, enjoyed support in rural areas, and controlled part of the criminal networks. After the war, the situation changed. Britain lost its status as an imperial hegemon, and the United States increased its influence. For the new generation of politicians, the idea of armed resistance seemed outdated, but no one dared to openly oppose the Irish Republican Army. The respect for the veterans of the War for Independence ran too deep. An unspoken balance formed. Dublin avoided interfering in the Irish Republican Army's activities in Northern Ireland, and the Irish Republican Army did not challenge the Irish government. By the late 1950s, the organization underwent reorganization and became active again. It launched the so-called Border Campaign, a series of attacks and sabotage operations on the border with Northern Ireland. It was only a shadow of the previous war in scale, but its impact was much greater. The campaign inspired a new generation of Catholics in Northern Ireland and reminded everyone that the issue of uniting the country remained unresolved. Meanwhile, life in the north of the island remained difficult. After the partition of Ireland in 1921, a sharp religious conflict persisted there. Protestants, descendants of Anglo-Scottish settlers, maintained ties with Britain and considered themselves true citizens of the Crown. They became known as Unionists. The word Unionist itself comes from union. These people considered themselves British and wanted to preserve the union with Great Britain. They were proud of the British flag, the crown, and the Protestant faith, seeing Catholics as a threat, not only politically, but also culturally, almost on a civilizational level. Catholics, who made up about a third of the population, remained second-class citizens. They faced discrimination when applying for jobs, had no access to political power, and there were hardly any Catholics in the police or administration. And as if the struggle with the English wasn't enough, there was also pressure from the Vatican. They were indeed actively interested in the Irish question. The document No Pope Here, Britain, the Vatican, the Irish Republican Army, and the Papal Visit to Ireland, from September 1979, authored by Martin Duerthy, points out that there were serious disagreements within the Vatican regarding the Irish question. Some Catholic hierarchs preferred to support British policy rather than the interests of Catholics in Northern Ireland. Another study noted that Protestant Ulster, the Northern Irish Protestants living in the province of Ulster, perceived the Catholic Church and its connection to Rome as a threat to their position. The text claims that Protestants saw the Vatican as a kind of conspiracy against them. A specific fact is also given. The Unionists and the Protestant community were alarmed by the 1908 decree Ne Temere and the subsequent papal order With the Greatest Zeal of 1911. Both documents concerned marriages between Catholics and non-Catholics, and they reinforced the Protestants' suspicions that the Vatican was interfering in Ireland's public affairs. This, in turn, strengthened the Unionist resistance to the idea of Irish self-government. In the 1960s, inspired by the civil rights movement in the United States, Northern Irish Catholics began to demand equality. They demanded police reform, an end to political arrests without trial, and the elimination of the unfair electoral system in which only homeowners could vote. In fact, this meant that most Catholics were deprived of the right to vote. At first, the protests were peaceful, but by the late 60s, attacks, arson, and retaliatory killings began. The British Army deployed troops to restore order. On January 30th, 1972, a tragedy occurred in the city of Derry, which went down in Irish history as Bloody Sunday. The soldiers opened fire on unarmed participants of the Civil Rights March. 13 people were killed, 14 were wounded. That day became a point of no return, the beginning of a new, much bloodier stage of the conflict. After that, Northern Ireland was completely divided. Among Catholics, two main groups formed: the official Irish Republican Army and the Provisional Irish Republican Army, alongside a dozen smaller factions. The Protestants had their own armed organizations, the Ulster Volunteer Force, the Ulster Defence Association, and others. Their differences were secondary. Each terrorist attack triggered a wave of retaliatory assaults, followed by a new spiral of violence. In 1972, the bloodiest year of the entire conflict, about 500 people were killed. Explosions and shootouts became part of everyday life. Cities turned into war zones, and neighborhoods were divided along religious lines. Protestants were afraid to enter Catholic districts, and Catholics were afraid to enter Protestant ones. Even children in schools knew which house was safe and which was not. After the early 70s, the Irish Republican Army no longer resembled the organization from Collins's time. It still had a clear goal: to drive out the English, give land and rights to Catholics, and eventually unite the island. But they had no plans for turning the guerrilla network into a political force, though they certainly had enough ambition. In 1972, representatives of the Irish Republican Army secretly arrived in London for negotiations. They demanded the withdrawal of British troops from Northern Ireland. The response was predictable: a refusal, and just 2 days later, the ceasefire was broken. By that time, in the Catholic areas, the Irish Republican Army had almost become a local government. Neither the British police nor the army operated there. The Irish Republican Army settled disputes, punished criminals, regulated marriages, and even intervened in everyday matters. In fact, it was a state within a state, where the word of the unit commander carried more weight than any law. British soldiers tried not to go there. Snipers and grenade launcher crews were waiting for them on the rooftops. The Irish Republican Army, of course, avoided open battles. Instead, they waged a guerrilla war: terrorist attacks, ambushes, explosions, assassinations of officials. In densely populated cities, this approach turned life into a never-ending nightmare. Of the more than 3,500 people killed during the entire conflict, half were civilians. But the concept of a civilian in Northern Ireland was relative. Almost everyone helped their own side. Some transported militants, Others hid weapons. Such small favors could cost a person their life. To at least somehow limit the violence, the authorities began building so-called peace lines, concrete and metal walls separating Catholic and Protestant neighborhoods. These walls still stand today, reminding us that peace in Northern Ireland is not final. If we look at the statistics, throughout the entire conflict, about 60% of those killed were caused by Catholic groups, 30% by Protestant groups, and around 10% by British military forces. But simple arithmetic doesn't reflect the essence. The British Army intervened not as a peacekeeper, but as a third force with its own interests. The guerrilla war lasted a long time. The resolution came in 1998, when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. It established the participation of both communities in governing the region and granted amnesty to most militants. At that time, about 1,700,000 people lived in Northern Ireland, 60% Protestants and 40% Catholics. The first minister was Unionist Peter Robinson, with Martin McGuinness, a former Irish Republican Army member who had served prison time for combat operations, as his deputy. Initially, Unionists were outraged, claiming they were betrayed and handed to terrorists, but with London insisting on peace, Protestants accepted the change. Catholics, however, were slow to give up their arms. The disarmament dragged on for years, and small underground groups still exist today, a kind of reserve that can be activated if old grievances resurface again. Some of the former fighters moved south to the Republic of Ireland, where they got involved in smuggling, illegal arms trading, and even a kind of business, folklore clubs and tours of battle sites. On the surface, Northern Ireland is calm today, but the tension hasn't disappeared. From time to time, car bombs are discovered, explosions happen, and fights break out during religious holidays. Formally, both sides have been granted amnesty, but people continue to live next to those who killed their friends and relatives. Forgiving this is not so easy. Of course, now it's only a few people a year rather than 100 as before, yet the memory of past decades has not disappeared. 500,000 people in Northern Ireland have seen violence with their own eyes at least once, and although the war ended long ago, peace remains fragile, especially since demographics are gradually changing the balance. Catholics are growing in number faster, while the traditional Protestant parties are weakening. More and more often, people say that in 10 years the question of the region's future may resurface with a new wave of radicalism, but under different circumstances. Sniper warfare. Still, the subject of snipers deserves separate discussion within the Civil War. This is quite a specific chapter, since people usually recall street protests, explosions, political confrontation, and the activities of underground groups. The sniper war developed gradually, starting from the late 60s, and became an integral part of the entire confrontation. Sniper tactics emerged as a response to the heavy presence of the army and police in urban areas, primarily in Belfast and Derry. Narrow streets, numerous alleys, abandoned houses, and dense neighborhoods created ideal conditions for sudden attacks. At first, sniper attacks were sporadic and mostly symbolic, but by the mid-70s they had become a full-fledged element of the Irish Republican Army's strategy, especially within the ranks of the Provisional Irish Republican Army, the most active faction of the IRA. The main task of the snipers was not to eliminate large numbers of opponents, but to deliver targeted strikes against military patrols. Sniper fire allowed the Republicans to operate relatively covertly and withdraw from combat without direct confrontation, which was especially important amid tight control of the streets and regular raids. Republican marksmen typically relied on weapons that could be easily upgraded and repaired in underground workshops. Civilian hunting rifles, old army models, and weapons smuggled in from the United States and the Middle East were widely used. Later, more powerful rifles began to be used, including the famous Barrett M82, which became one of the most notable technological changes in the sniper war. The Barrett rifle has a range of almost 2 kilometers, and it doesn't just shoot. It can penetrate brick and stone walls, armor plates rated to stop rifle rounds, concrete blocks, and even light armored vehicles. The British Army noted that the armor of patrol vehicles couldn't withstand even a single hit, and the bullets would reach their target. In 1990, a soldier named Kirk Ward was killed with a Barrett. The shot was fired from a distance of over 300 meters through a narrow gap in the wall of a farmer's barn. The British soldier's body armor didn't save him. The Barrett bullet went right through it. In 1993, a bullet struck Corporal James McManus. This was one of the most accurate shots by the Irish Republican Army. The soldier stood behind a Land Rover's armored shield, but the sniper shot through the narrow gap between the pillar and armor plate. A few days later, the British Army increased the thickness of the side armor on their patrol vehicles. In total, the group is credited with the deaths of about 10 servicemen. It's important that they operated almost unnoticed. The British forces were only able to arrest some of the members by chance, due to a vehicle inspection that found rifles being transported. Sniper groups almost always operated in small teams: a shooter, a spotter, and a driver. They carefully studied patrol routes, armored vehicle movement schedules, and the features of the city layout. One of the most well-known areas where sniper activity became almost routine was South Armagh, a rural area near the border with the Republic of Ireland. Here, Republican snipers used the rural terrain, abandoned farms, and a network of country roads. This area became known in the press as the Sniper Triangle. The most well-known was the group of snipers from South Armagh, who operated in the 1990s. Despite the relatively small number of attacks, their activities had a serious impact on the morale of British units. And it wasn't just about the use of powerful Barrett rifles, carefully planned retreat tactics, and minimizing information leaks. The very fact of the presence of such snipers forced government forces to remain under constant stress. After all, the local residents won't help. A shot could be fired at any moment, and even armored vehicles won't save you. In response, the British Army reinforced patrol vehicles, constantly changed the routes of mobile units, and used observation posts. Special sniper towers appeared in urban areas, metal structures rising above residential neighborhoods. From there, government snipers tried to spot Republican snipers. Sniper teams hardly used radio communication. All their work was based on hand signals and prearranged escape routes. This only allowed British intelligence services to intercept information occasionally. The American connection. You might ask, where is the influence of the United States? Initially, we mentioned interference from London, the Vatican, and Washington, but so far we've only discussed two. That's a separate and interesting topic. Researchers note that the trail of the Irish Republican Army extended far beyond Ireland and led to the United States, to one of the Irish-American organizations known as NORAID. This organization raised funds to support Irish Republican Army militants, and some sources claim that through NORAID, the supply of weapons and equipment was actually controlled by American intelligence agencies. Witnesses and archival reports claim that this money and weapons were not simply transferred as charitable aid, but were directed toward specific operations of the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland. Officially, no one has ever confirmed this, but British officers who worked with intelligence insisted that the CIA not only turned a blind eye to such actions, but sometimes it even seemed as if they were encouraged. Former British intelligence analysts recall that the NORAID network operated as a carefully organized chain. Funds were collected by the Irish diaspora, passed through branches in the US, and then sent through secret channels to the north of the island. Some authors note that such an organized supply chain could not have been accidental. It functioned as a tool in a geopolitical game, in which the Irish Republican Army, while fighting for independence, unintentionally became part of a much broader system of influence. Some believe the United States viewed the Northern Ireland conflict as a way to weaken the United Kingdom, and the timing was just right. The height of the Cold War, at the end of which the United States gained the status of global hegemon, in part by further weakening one of the former hegemons and the largest empire of its time, the British Empire. In this logic, the Irish Republican Army became not only a liberation movement, but also a means of external pressure on London. Access to weapons, finances, and information allowed the militants to operate much more effectively than could be expected based on their numbers and local capabilities. Thus, the Irish Republican Army existed at the intersection of two worlds. It was a popular movement, and at the same time, an object of manipulation by external forces. Internal operations, shootouts, sabotage, and countermeasures, all of this fit into a larger scenario where the lines between the struggle for independence and international strategic interests became blurred. And in this context, neither a single victory nor a single defeat of the Irish Republican Army was a completely isolated event. Every operation had its invisible shadows in London, across the ocean, in Washington, and among the American and Irish diaspora. Modern times. So, how are things in the southern part of the divided island? How is the Republic doing? More than 10 years ago, reforms began in Ireland, a country that was previously almost exclusively agricultural and, frankly, poor compared to its prosperous neighbors, which allowed it to become not only a European but also a global leader in GDP per capita. This economic phenomenon was called the Celtic Tiger, by analogy with the developing countries of the Asian region. The name is strange, but the main thing is that it works. The introduction of a low corporate tax rate, which dropped to 12.5%, played a crucial role in the development of the Irish economy at that time. Thanks to this, the European headquarters of global IT giants, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, PayPal, Yahoo, Google, Twitter, LinkedIn, Airbnb, and other unicorns immediately moved to the island. The advantages are multi-billion-dollar injections into the country's budget, allowing the country to afford a great deal. The downsides are a sharp increase in prices for literally everything, which happened due to the massive influx of foreign specialists filling the constantly opening vacancies. By the way, after the corporate tax was lowered, the pharmaceutical industry began to thrive in Ireland alongside the IT industry. Many international banks have offices in Dublin. 25% of the computers produced in Europe are made here. American high-tech companies are actively investing tens of millions of dollars in the Irish economy. Today, this is one of the fastest-growing countries in the European Union. At the moment, just over 4.5 million people live in this country. That's even less than in St. Petersburg. But there are plenty of Irish people all over the world. The first thing you need to know about the weather in Ireland is how relative the phrase Northern Ireland really is. Yes, in a geographical sense, that's true, but the key role here is played by the warm Gulf Stream current, which branches out from the south and makes the eastern coast of the island relatively warm all year round. For example, on December 29th, Dublin became the warmest place in Europe, because even in the shade it was 15 degrees Celsius. Snow, the kind that stays on the ground for several days, falls only once every few years, and it's such a unique event that the Republic is completely unprepared for snowfalls. Cars and public transport come to a halt for those couple of days, store shelves are empty, and people don't go to work. Knowing this peculiarity, as soon as the locals hear a weather warning about possible snow or a storm, they rush to buy what they consider the two most essential products, milk and bread, which of course aren't enough for everyone because of the rush. Fortunately, besides their fear of the cold, Islanders have another innate quality, a great sense of humor. So pub owners, who never close their establishments under any circumstances, came up with a funny promotion. With the purchase of a pint of beer, you'd get a piece of the coveted bread for free. The Irish happily celebrated the apocalypse instead of trudging through the unusual snow to a boring job. Overall, the average winter temperature in Dublin is 6 degrees Celsius above zero. Several times a season, storms come in from the ocean, and it's better to stay home during them. Both in late December and early February, there may be a few sunny days with temperatures reaching 15 degrees Celsius. So compared to the weather in the northern capital of Russia, for example, Dublin is just like a resort. Maybe that's why the Irish don't like to dress warmly. Warm jackets, down coats, pants, those aren't for them. No matter the weather, it's shorts and a windbreaker. It often happens that an Irishman owns two plots of land, one on the coast and another inland. Both plots have all the utilities connected, and so, when the storm season, rains, and piercing winds begin here at the start of winter, they simply move the house away from the ocean to the central part of the country. In spring, they bring it back to the sea and the pleasant, salty air. The cost of residential houses starts at 10,000 euros. That's about 700,000 rubles, without finishing. It's moved twice a year. It turns out to be much more economical than maintaining a house that stands empty for an entire season. Referendum. It's a sacred word for every Irish person. If a controversial issue arises in the Republic, or people start discussing changes to the law, there will be a referendum. The Islanders can't even imagine, not even in their worst nightmares, that someone from the government wouldn't consult the people and would start issuing decrees that could affect citizens' private lives. That's why they hold votes there regularly. Abortion, decriminalization of jokes about religion, lowering the age for presidential candidates, abolition of the death penalty, divorce proceedings. Everything is decided by referendums. By the way, to participate in voting, it's enough to have a residence permit. And since you are a taxpayer, Your vote will be counted. Religion, the main treasure of Ireland, which they actively share with the whole world, is their favorite holiday, St. Patrick's Day. It is celebrated every year on the 17th of March. This is the most significant date for every Irish person living anywhere on the planet. St. Patrick, being a bishop, actively preached Christianity in Ireland, founded either 300 or 600 churches, and personally baptized more than 120,000 Irish people. The symbol of the holiday is the shamrock. People dress up in green clothes and leprechaun costumes. The holiday is celebrated on a grand scale. Parades, processions, and festivals are organized on the streets of cities. In Chicago, on this day, they even dye the river that runs through the entire city green. In general, this country is very religious. During the Civil War, all Protestants were expelled to Northern Ireland solely on religious grounds. Here, religion is indicated everywhere, in all documents. It's even difficult for a non-Catholic child to go to kindergarten, and schools, which are strictly Catholic from the age of 4, are always attached to a church. Boys and girls study separately. Elementary school teachers are nuns with teaching degrees. Sports are mandatory, and both boys and girls play the national sport, rugby. At the same time, old church buildings can be sold if they're no longer needed or turned into stores. A sign saying "Church for Sale" is no joke, because the building stands empty when the parishioners get an education and trade religion for books. So it's not surprising that one of these buildings has been turned into a pub. St. Mary's Church in Dublin was built in the early 18th century. The founder of the brewery company, Arthur Guinness, was married there himself, and at the age of 23, a local entrepreneur bought the abandoned church, renovated it, and opened a pub there. He restored the organ and stained glass windows and placed a bar counter and tables for visitors in the center of the hall. Now this unusual establishment is extremely popular because pubs in Ireland are sacred. Pubs. Pub is short for public house. Regulars have been coming here for decades not to get drunk, but to talk over 2 or 3 pints. Sports, politics, the weather, and of course, local news are the topics for discussion. And the bartender, who knows everything and everyone, is the link between the customers. So the Irish bartender, especially in local pubs, is almost always a mature man who can both keep up a conversation and politely let a tipsy customer know that he's had enough. Any significant event is celebrated in bars, meeting with friends, a birthday, getting paid, or just Friday. Almost like in Russia. Our countries are even next to each other in the alcohol consumption rankings, 6th and 7th place, respectively. In general, the Irish are often compared to us. It's believed that a Russian and an Irishman will always understand each other. Both Russia and Ireland are, to some extent, on the outskirts of Europe. That's why we have more of a mentality inclined toward community and social connection than other Europeans, who are more individualistic and focused on themselves. Or take the behavior of pedestrians in the Irish capital, for example. The locals cross the street whenever and wherever they want. A red light? Well, it looks like there are no cars coming. Let's go. Is it really not allowed to cross the road here? Come on, I'll be quick. Are there actually cars coming? Let's go anyway. May St. Patrick protect us. Some people think that even our folk music is very similar. For example, the Irish traditional dance reel is very much like the Russian barinya, but there are more pubs in Ireland than we have. In Dublin, there is 1 pub for every 100 people, and the oldest continuously operating pub in the world is also in Ireland. It is over 1,000 years old. This is Sean's Bar, in the city of Athlone. In 2004, it was entered into the Guinness Book of Records, and this book was founded by the Guinness Brewing Company. They produce the most popular Irish beer, which has long since become a legend. Some people think that in Ireland it has a special taste, that it is brewed according to a special recipe only on the island. But the Guinness brand inspector in Ireland claims that this is a misconception. The differences in taste appear solely because of relative freshness, since it can take up to 2 months from production to consumption of the beer. In any case, the Irish love beer very much. And in terms of per capita consumption, they are second only to the Czechs. Each local resident drinks just over 130 liters per year, and probably, so that Dubliners don't confuse their own door with their neighbors after leaving the pub at night, all the doors in this city are painted in different colors. There are almost no black or brown ones. The Irish haven't heard anything about Belarus, but they believe they've invented the best beer snack in the world, one you can't find anywhere else. To prepare this exquisite dish, you need to grate potatoes, mix them with eggs, flour, and salt, and then make small potato pancakes. They're called boxty. Well, someday they'll find out about draniki, or kartoplayaniki, as Belarusians also call them. Also, in Ireland, no stores are open on Sundays. That's unusual for us. But in Dublin, even in the smallest shop, you won't be offered plastic bags, only paper ones. And here are a few more interesting facts about this country. There are no snakes in Ireland. A long time ago, the country was covered by a glacier. In such conditions, no reptile could survive. When the glacier melted, Ireland was already separated from other lands by the sea, and snakes couldn't get there. Great Britain wasn't so lucky in this regard. This island separated from Europe only after the glacier had receded, and its southern edge wasn't covered by ice, so snakes are doing just fine there. Because of its isolation from the mainland, you also won't find moles, ferrets, or weasels on the island. And the Irish absolutely love cats. There are twice as many cats in the country as there are dogs. At the same time, Ireland can boast the largest dog breed in the world, proudly called the Irish Wolfhound. But the Irish people's greatest asset is their down-to-earth outlook on life. Famous Irish wisdom says, there are only two things you need to worry about, whether you are healthy or sick. If you are healthy, then there is no reason to worry. And if you are sick, then there are only two things you should be concerned about, whether you will recover or die. If you recover, there is no reason to worry. But if you die, then there are two things to worry about, whether you will go to heaven or to hell. If you go to heaven, then you definitely have nothing to worry about. But if you go to hell, you'll be so damn busy shaking hands with your friends that you won't have any time to worry. A familiar approach, don't you think? Anyway, that's all we wanted to tell you about Ireland. Rate this episode fairly and write in the comments which other countries you'd like to learn more about. See you on Cremola.